The water closed over his head before he could take a full breath, and that was exactly what he wanted. Draven felt the cold shock of the lake rush into his lungs as he let his body go limp, sinking below the surface where the moonlight could not follow. Above him, he could hear the muffled screams already starting, voices calling his name, feet pounding against the wooden dock. He forced himself to stay still, to let the current pull him further from the shore, even though every instinct in his body screamed at him to fight his way back up. This was the only way. He had tried everything else. 3 days earlier, the council had informed him that his marriage to Elena Whitfield would be finalized at the next full moon gathering, whether he agreed to it or not. They had used words like duty and legacy and the good of the pack, but Draven had heard the truth underneath those words. They wanted a puppet king, someone whose bond would tie the Ashcroft pack to the Whitfield territory forever, someone who would stop asking questions about where the pack's resources were really going. He was not going to be that man. So when the betrothal ceremony had been scheduled at Silver Lake, under the full moon, in front of every pack member who mattered, Draven had made his decision. He would vanish, not run, not hide in some border town where trackers could find him within a week. He would die, publicly, dramatically, in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to the council before the ink on the marriage contract had even dried. A missing king could be found. A dead king could not be unburied. He held his breath and let his body drift with the current, feeling the tug of the deeper water beneath the lake's calm surface. Somewhere above him, chaos was breaking out, exactly as he had planned. He counted the seconds in his head, waiting for the current to carry him far enough that no one would think to search this stretch of shoreline. 6 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. His lungs began to burn, and doubt crept into his mind for the first time. He had practiced holding his breath for minutes at a time in the private baths of the pack house, but the icy shock of open water was different. His limbs felt heavier than he expected, pulled down by more than just his own weight. He tried to kick toward the surface just enough to break through for air, but the current was stronger here than it had looked from the shore, twisting him sideways instead of up. For the first time since he had planned this elaborate escape, Draven felt something close to real fear. He was the Alpha King. He had faced down rival packs, survived poison meant for his father, stood his ground against enforcers twice his size, in training rings that left grown wolves broken. But none of that mattered here, in the dark water, where his wolf instincts screamed at him to shift, to fight, to do something other than float helplessly toward whatever the current wanted. He would not shift. If anyone caught sight of wolf fur breaking the surface, the entire plan would collapse. He needed to be found, eventually, as a man, unconscious, believably drowned. Shifting now would ruin everything. So he did the only thing he could. He let go of the fight and trusted the plan. His vision blurred at the edges, dark spots creeping in from the corners of his sight. He thought, with strange calm, that this was either going to work perfectly, or it was going to be the last mistake he ever made. Then something changed. The current shifted, pushing him toward shallower water, near a bend in the lake that the ceremony guests would not have been watching. His knees scraped against soft mud. His head broke the surface just enough for him to gasp in a mouthful of air before the current pulled him under again. That single breath was enough to keep him from truly drowning, but not enough to clear his mind. The world became a blur of cold water, moonlight, and the distant sound of his own name, being shouted by people who thought they were watching him die. He did not know how long he drifted like that, caught between consciousness and the dark. It might have been minutes. It might have been longer. What he did know, when awareness finally returned in fragments, was that hands smaller than his own were pulling at his shoulders, dragging him against a strong current toward a muddy bank, far from where the ceremony had been held. He heard a voice, young and breathless, speaking words he could not quite piece together yet. Something about staying with her, something about not giving up. He wanted to tell her that he had a plan, that this was supposed to happen, that she did not need to worry, but his body would not obey him, and the last thing he felt before darkness took him completely was the press of small hands against his chest, steady and sure, refusing to let him go. Wren Sutter had not meant to become anyone's hero that night. She had walked to the edge of Silver Lake with a woven basket over her arm, searching for silver leaf and moonflower petals that only bloomed properly under a full moon. Her grandmother's cough had gotten worse over the past week, and the healer in the village had told her that a tea made from fresh moonflower would ease the tightness in the old woman's chest better than anything bought at the market. Ren was not important enough to be invited to the betrothal ceremony happening on the other side of the lake. She was an Omega, with no rank, no political weight, and no family name worth mentioning in pack meetings. She had grown used to being invisible at gatherings like this, the kind of person whose presence went unnoticed, even when she stood in the same room as everyone else. That invisibility was usually a comfort to her. Tonight, it meant she was the only one paying attention when something struck the water on the far side of the lake, with enough force to send ripples all the way to where she stood. At first, she thought it might be an animal, a deer startled into the shallows, or a fish jumping for insects near the surface. But then she heard the shouting start, distant and panicked, carried across the water by the still night air. She caught fragments of words, fallen in, get him out, someone dive. She should have stayed where she was. It was not her business, not her ceremony, not her king to save. The betrothal guests had enforcers among them, trained wolves who could shift and swim faster than any Omega ever could. They would handle it. But something in the tone of the shouting made her stomach twist with unease, and before she had fully decided to move, her feet were already carrying her along the muddy bank toward the sound. She rounded a bend in the shoreline and saw him then, a dark shape floating face down in the shallow water near a cluster of reeds, far from where the ceremony lights glowed across the lake. No one else was close enough to see him from this angle. The enforcers and guests were all gathered near the dock, shouting and pointing toward the deeper water where the disturbance had first been seen. They were looking in the wrong place. Ren did not think. She dropped her basket on the bank, kicked off her shoes, and waded into the cold water without a moment's hesitation, gasping as the chill hit her skin. The lake bottom was soft and uneven beneath her feet, and by the time she reached him, the water had risen to her chest. She grabbed his shoulder and pulled, using every bit of strength her slight frame could manage. He was heavier than she expected, solid muscle beneath soaked clothing, but adrenaline gave her a strength she did not normally have. She dragged him toward the shallows, fighting against the pull of the current with each step, until finally, the ground beneath her feet rose enough that she could get proper footing. She hauled him onto the muddy bank, rolling him onto his back, the way she had once seen a healer demonstrate during a village safety lesson years ago. His face was pale in the moonlight, his lips tinged with a faint blue that made her heart pound with fear. She had never done this before. She had only watched it done once, on a dummy made of straw and cloth during a lesson she had almost skipped. But her hands moved anyway, some instinct guiding her as she checked for breath, found none, and began pressing rhythmically against his chest, counting under her breath the way she remembered being taught. "Come on," she whispered between counts. "Come on, please." She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed air into his lungs the way the healer had shown, then returned to pressing on his chest, over and over, her arms beginning to ache with the effort. The shouting from across the lake continued, but no one had noticed the two figures on the far bank yet. Ren was alone with him, fighting for a life she did not even know the name of. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than a minute, he coughed. Water spilled from his mouth as his body convulsed, and Ren quickly turned him onto his side the way instinct told her to, letting him expel the lake water from his lungs in violent, ragged coughs. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, relief flooding through her so intensely that her vision blurred with unexpected tears. He was alive. Whoever he was alive. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found her face in the moonlight. She saw confusion there, and something else she could not quite name, an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how close she was kneeling to a complete stranger, both of them soaked and shivering on the muddy bank of the lake. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you know your name?" He stared at her for a long moment before answering, his voice hoarse and rough from the water still in his throat. "Rune," he said finally. "My name is Rune." It was not his real name. Ren had no way of knowing that, of course. She only knew that the stranger she had just pulled from certain drowning was alive, breathing, and looking at her with an expression she would spend the rest of the night trying to understand. Across the lake, the shouting had grown louder, more organized now, as enforcers began wading into the deeper water, where the disturbance had first been spotted. Ren realized, with a jolt, that whoever this man was, the people searching for him, were looking in entirely the wrong place, and something about the timing, the direction he had fallen from, and the strange stillness in his eyes, made her hesitate before calling out to alert them. "We should get you help," she said instead, glancing toward the distant lights of the ceremony. "There are people searching the lake. I heard them shouting." Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "No," he said, his hand suddenly gripping her wrist with more strength than she expected from someone who had just been unconscious. "Please. Not yet." Ren frowned, confusion and concern warring inside her. "Why not? If you fell in during the ceremony, your family will be worried. They are probably terrified right now, searching for you." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face, as if trying to decide something important, some calculation happening behind his eyes that she could not follow. Finally he spoke, his voice low and careful. "I do not want them to find me tonight. Please. I know this makes no sense to you, but I am asking you to trust me." It made absolutely no sense to her. A drowning man, moments after being pulled from the water, asking a complete stranger to keep his survival secret from the very people searching for him. Every instinct told her this was wrong, that she should call out immediately, that whatever was happening here was not her business to hide. But there was something in his eyes, exhausted and pleading, in a way that felt more honest than anything she had encountered from pack nobility before, and against every practical instinct she possessed, Ren found herself nodding slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I will not tell them. But you need somewhere to go, somewhere warm and dry, before you catch your death from the cold, if the lake did not already try to take it." A faint, exhausted smile crossed his lips at that, the first sign of humor breaking through the tension between them. "My cottage is not far," she continued, standing and offering him a hand to help him rise. "My grandmother is there, but she will not ask questions if I tell her you are a traveler who needs shelter for a few nights." He accepted her hand, and even in his weakened state, Ren felt the strength in his grip, the barely restrained power in muscles that had nearly given out entirely just minutes ago. As they made their slow way along the dark shoreline, away from the shouting and the searchlights, away from everything familiar to him, Draven Ashcroft understood that his plan had worked far better than he had ever expected. He had wanted to disappear. He had not expected to be pulled from the water by hands so gentle and so fierce at once, by an Omega who asked for nothing and offered everything, without a second thought for what it might cost her. He did not know yet how much his life was about to change. He only knew, as they walked together into the darkness beyond the lake, that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than the crushing weight of his crown. He felt, strangely and impossibly, like he might actually be safe. The cottage sat at the edge of the village, tucked between two old oak trees that Ren's grandfather had planted decades earlier. It was small and modest, nothing like the grand halls Draven was accustomed to, but there was a warmth to it that no amount of gold in his own palace had ever managed to create. Ren's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman named Nora, did not ask many questions when her granddaughter arrived home, soaked to the bone, supporting a stranger who could barely stand. She took one look at the man's exhausted face and the girl's determined expression, and simply moved to stoke the fire higher, setting a kettle to boil without a word of protest. "He fell in the lake," Ren explained, helping Draven settle onto a chair near the fireplace. "He needs somewhere warm to recover for a few nights." Nora studied him for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. "Does he have a name?" she asked, addressing Ren but keeping her eyes fixed on Draven. "Rune," he answered for himself, his voice steadier now than it had been on the shore. "I am grateful for your hospitality. I will not stay longer than necessary, and I will find some way to repay your kindness." Nora made a small sound of dismissal, waving a hand as though the idea of repayment was beneath consideration. "Kindness is not a debt, young man. Drink your tea and get warm before you catch a fever that will keep you here far longer than you would like." Draven found himself oddly moved by the simplicity of it. No calculations about political advantage, no weighing of what benefit might come from helping a stranger. Just an old woman, offering warmth because it was the right thing to do, and a granddaughter who had risked her own safety in cold water, without a single thought for herself. He drank the tea. It tasted of herbs he did not recognize, slightly bitter, but not unpleasant, and warmth spread through his chest as he sipped it slowly, watching Ren move around the small kitchen with practiced ease, preparing a simple meal from what little the cottage had to offer. Over the following days, Draven settled into a rhythm of life he had never experienced before. He woke each morning to the sound of birds outside the cottage window, rather than the rigid schedule of pack business waiting to consume his every hour. He helped Ren gather firewood, clumsy at first with tasks his hands had never been trained for, though his wolf strength made the work far easier for him than it would have been for an ordinary man. Ren laughed at him more than once during those early days, gently teasing him for his lack of practical skills despite his obvious physical strength. "You hold an axe like you have never seen one before," she told him on the second morning, watching him struggle to split a log that should have taken half the effort he was using. "I have led a sheltered life," he replied, which was truer than she could possibly know. She showed him how to angle the axe properly, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of moonflower still clinging to her from the previous night's harvest. Something in his chest tightened at her nearness, an awareness that had nothing to do with gratitude for her rescue, and everything to do with something deeper, something his wolf recognized before his mind fully understood it. His wolf had been unusually quiet since the lake, subdued in a way that worried him slightly, until he realized the silence was not distress but contentment. Whenever Ren was near, his wolf settled, calm and steady, the way it had never settled around Elena Whitfield, despite months of forced proximity during their arranged courtship. It was a feeling he recognized from stories, from the old tales pack elders told about mate bonds and fated connections, though he had long since stopped believing such things applied to someone like him. His father had never found a true mate. His grandfather had married for alliance and nothing more. Draven had assumed his own path would follow the same pattern, a life built on obligation rather than any deeper connection. But here, in this small cottage far from the pack house and all its politics, something in him was waking up that he had never expected to feel. He watched Ren interact with her grandmother, patient and gentle even when Nora's cough worsened in the evenings, requiring extra doses of the tea Ren prepared with such careful attention. He watched her tend to the small garden behind the cottage, humming quietly to herself as she worked, unaware that she was being observed with an intensity that would have alarmed her had she noticed it. She was nothing like the Omegas he had encountered in pack circles, the ones who understood their worth only in terms of what alliance they might bring, or what favor they might curry with powerful families. Ren asked for nothing from him. She did not know his true identity, did not know the wealth and power that could have been hers simply by asking the right questions, and yet she gave freely of what little she had without a moment's hesitation. On the fourth evening, as they sat together outside the cottage watching the stars emerge over the tree line, Ren finally asked the question he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Where are you from, Rune?" she asked quietly, her knees drawn up to her chest as she looked at him in the fading light. "You speak like someone with an education, but you handle tools like you have never worked with your hands before, and there is something about you that feels like you are hiding a great deal." Draven considered his answer carefully, weighing the risk of the truth against the growing discomfort of the lie. "I come from a family with complicated expectations," he said finally, choosing his words with precision. "I was supposed to marry someone I did not choose, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with duty. I could not accept that future, so I found a way to escape it." Ren was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "Is that why you did not want them to find you at the lake? Were you running from the marriage?" "In a manner of speaking," he admitted. "It is complicated in ways I cannot fully explain right now, but I promise you, Ren, I am not a dangerous man, and I mean no harm to you or your grandmother by staying here." She studied his face in the moonlight, searching for something, though he could not be certain what she was looking for. Finally she nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever answer she found in his expression. "I believe you," she said simply. "Everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path, even when duty says otherwise." Her words struck something deep inside him, a validation he had never received from anyone in the pack hierarchy, where duty was always presented as the highest virtue, above personal happiness, above choice, above everything else that made a life worth living. "Thank you," he said quietly, and meant it more than she could know. As the days continued, the bond between them deepened in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. Draven found himself memorizing the small details of her existence, the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the particular laugh she gave when something genuinely delighted her, rather than the polite laughter she offered to strangers in the village market. He learned that she had lost her parents to a sickness that swept through the outer villages years earlier, leaving her and Nora to fend for themselves, with little support from the wider pack structure. He learned that despite this hardship, she held no bitterness, only quiet determination to care for the family she had left, and to help others whenever she could, regardless of what rank or recognition it might bring her. She never once asked him for anything beyond honest company and shared labor. She never pressed him for more details about his past than he was willing to give, respecting the boundaries he set even as her curiosity clearly grew with each passing day. His wolf, meanwhile, grew more insistent with each night that passed. It urged him closer to her, whispered instincts he had never fully trusted before, recognized something in her scent and her presence that felt less like coincidence and more like destiny finally revealing itself after years of searching for a truth he had not known he was missing. He began to suspect, though he was not yet ready to voice the thought even to himself, that the drowning he had faked to escape one forced bond might have led him directly into the arms of another, except this one was not being forced upon him by anyone. This one, if it was real, was something his own heart and his own wolf were choosing freely, for the first time in his entire life. Back within the walls of the Ashcroft pack house, chaos had taken hold in ways that would have alarmed Draven had he been there to witness it firsthand. The council chamber, usually a place of measured discussion and careful political maneuvering, had become a battleground of competing voices, each demanding answers no one could provide. The Alpha King was dead, drowned in Silver Lake during his own betrothal ceremony, and with no confirmed heir and no body yet recovered from the depths, the pack stood on the edge of a crisis that threatened to tear apart generations of careful order. Elena Whitfield sat at the head of the table where Draven should have been, her expression carefully arranged into one of grief, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed how quickly her tears had dried once the initial shock wore off. "We must have a search continued through the week," Elena said, her voice carrying practiced sorrow. "The Alpha King deserves a proper recovery and burial, not an unmarked grave beneath the lake." Percy Ashford, the eldest member of the council, and a man who had served 3 generations of Ashcroft kings, watched Elena with narrowed eyes that missed nothing. "And what of succession, Lady Whitfield?" he asked pointedly. The king had no confirmed heir. Without a body confirming his death beyond doubt, and without a named successor, the pack has no clear path forward. Elena's composure flickered, just slightly, before she recovered. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "the council should consider that my bond with Draven, though not yet formalized through mating, still carries weight in matters of succession. As is intended, I believe I have standing to guide the pack until a proper heir can be determined." A murmur ran through the assembled council members, some nodding in cautious agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances that suggested they were not entirely convinced by Elena's sudden claim to authority. Percy leaned back in his chair, studying her with the patience of a man who had seen countless political maneuvers over his long years of service. "That is a bold claim, Lady Whitfield, considering the bond was never completed, and considering how convenient the timing of this tragedy appears to be, given the ceremony that was meant to occur that very night." Elena's eyes flashed with anger, quickly masked. "Are you suggesting something, Percy?" "I am suggesting nothing," he replied smoothly. "I am simply noting facts for the council's consideration. We should proceed carefully, and we should continue the search for the king's body with full effort, rather than rushing toward conclusions that conveniently benefit certain parties in the room." The tension in the chamber grew thick enough to feel, and Elena excused herself shortly after, her expression carefully neutral even as fury simmered beneath the surface. She had worked too hard, planned too carefully, to have her path to power questioned now by an old man, clinging to procedures that no longer served the pack's best interests. Outside the chamber, she found Gareth Voss waiting for her, one of the enforcers who had been present at the lake the night of the supposed drowning. Gareth was not a member of the council, but he held considerable influence among the enforcement ranks, and Elena had cultivated his loyalty carefully over the past several months, recognizing early on that she would need allies beyond the political chamber if her plans were to succeed. "They doubt me," she said quietly once they were alone in the corridor. "Percy questions everything, and the others follow his lead like frightened sheep." Gareth's expression remained impassive, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "The search teams have found nothing along the main stretch of the lake," he reported. "No body has surfaced, and the currents in that area do not typically carry things far from where they enter the water. Then widen the search, Elena snapped. I need a body, Gareth, or at the very least, I need confirmation that he is truly gone, so this uncertainty stops undermining my position. Gareth studied her for a long moment, before nodding slowly. I will take a team along the far bends of the lake myself, he said. If there is anything to find, I will find it. What he did not tell Elena, in that moment, was that he had already begun to suspect something the rest of the search parties had missed. During the initial search on the night of the ceremony, Gareth had noticed footprints along a distant section of the muddy shoreline, small ones alongside larger ones, both leading away from the lake toward the village, rather than remaining near the water where a body might be expected to wash ashore. He had not mentioned this to anyone yet, uncertain what it meant, unwilling to raise false hope or false alarm, until he had more information to act upon. But something about those footprints nagged at him, a detail that did not fit the simple narrative of a tragic drowning that everyone else seemed so eager to accept. Gareth was a careful man, methodical in his work, and he intended to investigate those footprints personally before drawing any conclusions that might complicate matters further. If the king had somehow survived, if he was out there somewhere, alive and hiding, for reasons Gareth could not yet fathom, then the pack deserved to know the truth, regardless of how that truth might disrupt the ambitions of those currently jockeying for power in his absence. He began his search the following morning, tracing the shoreline methodically, moving away from the main ceremony site toward the quieter bend where the footprints had first caught his attention. The trail was faint after several days of weather, but not impossible to follow for someone trained in tracking as thoroughly as Gareth had been throughout his years of service. The prince led him, eventually, toward the outskirts of a small village nestled at the edge of the pack's territory, a place so unremarkable that few pack officials ever had reason to visit. Gareth moved carefully through the village, asking quiet questions of shopkeepers and market vendors, careful not to reveal too much about what exactly he was searching for. It was an old woman, selling herbs at a modest stall, who finally gave him the piece of information he needed, though she likely had no idea of its significance. She mentioned, in passing conversation about local gossip, that a young Omega named Ren Sutter had recently taken in a stranger, a traveler who had apparently nearly drowned in the lake several nights earlier, and was now recovering at her family's cottage. Gareth felt a chill of realization move through him. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. A stranger, nearly drowned, appearing in the same village near the same lake, on the very night the Alpha King had supposedly perished. He did not rush toward the cottage immediately. Instead, he watched, observed, gathered more information before deciding how to proceed, understanding that whatever was happening here required careful handling rather than a hasty confrontation that might scare away answers he desperately needed. If the king truly was alive and hiding in this quiet village, Gareth intended to discover why, and more importantly, he intended to be the one who decided what to do with that knowledge before anyone else in the pack learned the truth. Unaware of the enforcer quietly tracking his trail, Draven spent his mornings falling deeper into a life he had never imagined for himself, one built on simple labor and honest company, rather than crowns and council chambers. One afternoon, as he helped Ren carry water from the village well, his wolf stirred with an intensity that nearly made him stumble. She had brushed against his arm, reaching for the bucket, an accidental touch that lasted no more than a second, yet it sent a jolt through him, unlike anything he had experienced before, a recognition so deep it felt like his entire body was finally remembering something it had always known. "Are you all right?" Ren asked, noticing his sudden stillness. "You look like you have seen a ghost." "I am fine," he assured her, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Just a strange feeling. It will pass." It did not pass. If anything, it grew stronger each day, a pull he could no longer ignore or dismiss as simple gratitude toward the woman who had saved his life. He had read about mate bonds in the old texts kept in the pack library, ancient stories describing a connection so powerful it transcended rank, wealth, and circumstance, a bond that chose two souls, regardless of what the world around them expected. He had never believed such bonds were real. Not truly. Not for someone like him, whose entire existence had been shaped by political calculation rather than fate. But here, in this small village, with an Omega who had no idea of his true identity, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his own life. That evening, after Nora had retired to bed and the cottage grew quiet around them, Draven found Wren sitting alone by the fire, mending a torn piece of clothing with careful, practiced stitches. He watched her for a long moment before speaking, uncertain how to voice what had been building inside him for days. "Wren," he said quietly, drawing her attention up from her work. "Can I ask you something that might sound strange?" She set aside her mending, giving him her full attention with the openness that had drawn him to her from the very first night. "Of course, Rune. You can ask me anything." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Do you believe in fate? In the idea that some connections between people are simply meant to happen, regardless of circumstance or timing?" Wren considered the question seriously, her brow furrowing in thought, rather than dismissing it as foolish. "I think," she said slowly, "that some people come into our lives exactly when we need them, even if we do not understand why at the time. My grandmother always said that the universe has a way of putting the right people in our path, even when everything else seems uncertain." Her answer, simple and unguarded, struck something deep within him. He wanted, desperately, to tell her everything in that moment, to reveal his true name, his true circumstances, the growing certainty in his heart that she was not simply the Omega who had pulled him from the lake, but the mate his wolf had been searching for his entire life. But fear held him back, fear that the truth would change everything between them, that once she learned he was the Alpha King she had unknowingly harbored, the easy warmth between them would collapse under the weight of his rank and everything it demanded from those around him. "I have grown very fond of you," he said instead, choosing words that felt safer than the full truth. "These past days here, with you and your grandmother, have meant more to me than I know how to express." A soft blush colored Wren's cheeks, visible even in the dim firelight. "I have grown fond of you as well," she admitted quietly. "There is something about you, Rune, something that feels familiar in a way I cannot quite explain, as though I have known you far longer than these few days would suggest." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, neither of them fully voiced, though both understood something significant was building beneath the surface of their careful friendship. Draven wanted to reach for her hand, to close the distance between them, and let his wolf's instincts guide him toward the bond it so desperately wanted to claim. But he held back, understanding that whatever grew between them needed to be built on honesty, not on the lie he was still maintaining about his identity. He could not, in good conscience, deepen this connection, while she remained ignorant of exactly who he was, and what claiming a bond with him would truly mean for her life. "I should let you rest," he said instead, standing abruptly before the moment could carry them further than he felt prepared to navigate honestly. "Good night, Wren." She watched him retreat toward the small room she had prepared for him near the kitchen, confusion evident in her expression at his sudden withdrawal. "Good night, Rune," she called after him softly, though something in her tone suggested she sensed there was more happening beneath the surface than he was willing to share. That night, Draven lay awake long after the cottage fell silent, wrestling with the weight of his deception, and the growing certainty that he could not maintain this false life indefinitely. Somewhere back at the pack house, chaos was surely unfolding in his absence, and every day he remained hidden was another day that political vultures like Elena Whitfield had to consolidate power in his name. He owed it to his pack, to the people who depended on stable leadership, to eventually return and reclaim his throne. But the thought of leaving this cottage, of leaving Wren behind, to return to a life of political obligation and forced marriage, felt like a betrayal of something more true than any duty he had ever been taught to honor. He did not yet know how he would resolve this conflict between duty and desire. He only knew, as sleep finally claimed him in the early hours of morning, that whatever path he chose next would need to include the truth, regardless of how difficult that truth might be for both of them to accept. Meanwhile, outside the cottage walls, in the shadows beneath the old oak trees Nora's husband had planted so many years ago, Gareth Voss watched the small home with careful, patient eyes, gathering the final pieces of confirmation he needed before deciding how to proceed with the discovery that would soon shake the entire pack to its foundation. Gareth waited 3 more days before making his move, watching the cottage from a distance, confirming the pattern of daily life within its walls, and studying the stranger's face closely enough, during one careful hidden observation, to feel the first true jolt of certainty settle into his bones. The build of the shoulders, the particular way the man carried himself despite his attempts to appear ordinary, the sharp intelligence behind eyes that no amount of borrowed simplicity could fully disguise. Gareth had served the Ashcroft pack for over a decade, had stood guard outside council chambers, and accompanied Draven on diplomatic missions to neighboring territories. He knew his king's face and bearing well enough that no disguise, however clever, could fool him indefinitely. He decided, finally, that direct confrontation would serve better than continued secrecy, though he chose his timing carefully, waiting for a moment when Wren had gone to the village market alone, leaving the cottage occupied only by Nora and the man calling himself Rune. Gareth approached the cottage in the late morning, his enforcer training keeping his movements quiet despite his considerable size. He knocked on the wooden door with measured firmness, watching as it opened to reveal Draven himself, dressed in simple village clothing that could not disguise the alertness that immediately sharpened in his eyes upon seeing a familiar face. "Gareth," Draven said quietly, all pretense dropping away in an instant. His voice carried the authority of a king, rather than the humble tone he had adopted for Wren's benefit these past days. "Your Majesty," Gareth replied, equally quiet, equally careful. "I had my suspicions, but I confess I did not fully believe them until this moment." Draven glanced quickly toward the village path, confirming Wren remained absent, before stepping outside and pulling the door partially closed behind him. "How did you find me?" he asked, his mind already racing through the implications of this discovery. "Footprints along the shoreline," Gareth explained simply, "and enough training to recognize when a story does not quite add up. You should know, Your Majesty, that the pack is in chaos without you. Lady Whitfield has begun positioning herself to claim authority in your absence, and Percy Ashford is the only council member actively resisting her attempts to consolidate power." Draven's jaw tightened at this information, the weight of his responsibilities crashing back into focus after days of blissful escape. "And the rest of the council?" "Divided," Gareth admitted. "Some believe Elena's claims have merit given the circumstances. Others remain loyal to the traditional succession laws, uncertain what to do without clear guidance or confirmation of your fate." Draven ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt warring within him as he considered the mess his escape had created, even as he understood the impossible situation that had driven him to this drastic action in the first place. "I need time," he said finally. "A little more time before I return and address this properly." Gareth's expression remained carefully neutral, though something like concern flickered behind his professional composure.
"Your Majesty, with respect, every day you remain hidden strengthens Lady Whitfield's position and weakens the pack's stability."
"The longer this continues, the harder it will be to reclaim your throne without significant conflict." "I understand the risks," Draven said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty churning inside him. "But there are things happening here that I need to resolve before I return to that world. Things that matter to me in ways I did not expect." Gareth's eyes moved briefly toward the cottage door, understanding dawning in his expression as he connected the pieces of what he had witnessed during his days of observation. "The Omega," he said quietly, "the one who saved you from the lake." Draven did not deny it, his silence confirmation enough for a man as perceptive as Gareth had proven himself to be. "I will return," he said finally, "but I need to handle this honestly, not simply vanish from her life the way I vanished from the ceremony. She deserves better than another disappearing act." Gareth considered this for a long moment, weighing his loyalty to the pack against whatever genuine concern he felt for the situation his king now found himself navigating. "I can buy you a few more days," he said finally. "I will report that my search found no definitive evidence, that further investigation is required before conclusions can be drawn. But Your Majesty, I would not recommend delaying much longer than that. Lady Whitfield is not a patient woman, and her ambitions grow bolder with each day that passes." "Thank you, Gareth," Draven said, genuine gratitude coloring his voice. "I will not forget this loyalty." Gareth nodded once, formal and precise, despite the unusual circumstances of their conversation. "Just do not make me regret this decision, Your Majesty. The pack needs its king, whatever complications you have found here in this village." As Gareth turned to leave, disappearing back down the path toward the main road that would eventually lead him back to pack territory, Draven remained standing outside the cottage door, his mind churning with the reality he could no longer avoid. Time was running out. Whatever future he wanted with Wren, whatever bond his wolf so desperately craved, needed to be built on complete honesty, and soon, before circumstances forced his hand in ways far less gentle than he would prefer. He turned back toward the cottage, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the peaceful illusion he had been living within these walls was about to shatter, one way or another, and there was nothing he could do to stop the reckoning that approached with each passing hour. Ren returned from the market that afternoon carrying a small bundle of supplies, humming softly to herself, unaware that everything was about to change. She noticed immediately that something felt different about Rune, a tension in his shoulders that had not been there when she left that morning, a distant quality to his gaze that made her stomach tighten with unease. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting her bundle down on the kitchen table. "You seem troubled." "I am fine," he said, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "Just tired." She did not fully believe him, but she let the matter drop, understanding that pressing too hard might only push him further into whatever quiet distance had settled over him. Instead, she busied herself with preparing dinner, chatting lightly about the market gossip she had overheard, trying to coax some of his usual warmth back through simple conversation. It was later that evening, while helping tidy the small room where Draven had been staying, that Ren made the discovery that would upend everything she thought she understood about the man she had rescued from the lake. She had gone to gather his damp clothing for washing, the same clothes he had worn the night she pulled him from the water, still tucked away in a corner where they had been left to dry. As she lifted the heavy fabric of his coat, something fell from an inner pocket she had not noticed before, clattering softly against the wooden floor. She bent to retrieve it, expecting perhaps a coin or a simple trinket, and instead found herself holding a signet ring, heavy and ornate, bearing a crest she recognized instantly from having seen it displayed on pack banners throughout her entire life. The Ashcroft crest, the symbol of the Alpha King himself, unmistakable in its design and craftsmanship. Her hands began to tremble as pieces clicked into place with dizzying speed. The betrothal ceremony at the lake, the timing of his near drowning, his insistence that no one be told he had survived, his careful avoidance of certain questions about his past and his family. Rune was not simply a traveler who had fallen into the lake. Rune was Draven Ashcroft, the Alpha King himself, and he had been lying to her grandmother, to everyone in this village, since the very first night she had pulled him from the water with her own hands. She stood frozen for a long moment, the ring heavy and cold in her palm, before hearing footsteps approaching the doorway behind her. She turned to find Draven standing there, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to dawning horror as he registered what she was holding. "Ren," he began, his voice careful, cautious. "Is this true?" she asked, holding up the ring, her voice trembling with a mixture of emotions she could not fully separate. "Are you the Alpha King?" He did not answer immediately, and his silence was answer enough. She felt something cold settle in her chest, betrayal mixing with confusion, and a strange, aching hurt that surprised her with its intensity. "Yes," he finally admitted, closing the distance between them slowly, as though approaching a startled animal that might flee at any sudden movement. "I am Draven Ashcroft. I faked my drowning to escape a forced marriage the council was trying to arrange. I never meant to deceive you this deeply, Ren, but once you saved me, once I realized what was happening between us, I did not know how to tell you the truth without losing everything we had built here." Ren felt tears burning at the edges of her vision, though she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to let this revelation break her composure entirely. "You let me believe you were someone else," she said, her voice sharper now, edged with hurt. "You let me care for a lie, Draven. Every conversation, every moment we shared, was built on something false." "Not everything," he said quickly, urgently, closing the last of the distance between them. "My feelings for you were never false, Ren. Everything I felt during our conversations, the comfort I found in your presence, the way my wolf responds to you unlike anything I have ever experienced before, none of that was a lie. Only my name was false, and I regret that deception more than I can properly express." She stepped back from him, needing space to process the flood of information crashing over her. "You are a king," she said, almost to herself, as though trying to make the reality settle properly in her mind. "You have a betrothed, political obligations, an entire pack depending on you. I am nothing compared to all of that. I am an unranked Omega who happened to be at the right place at the right moment." "You are not nothing," Draven said, his voice fierce with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Ren, listen to me. My wolf recognized something in you from the very first moment you pulled me from that water. I believe, with everything in me, that you are my true mate, chosen by fate rather than politics or convenience. That connection has nothing to do with rank or wealth or anything the council might value. It is simply true, whether either of us fully understands why. Ren's breath caught at his words, the weight of what he was suggesting settling over her with dizzying force. A mate bond, with the Alpha King himself, discovered through a lie she had unknowingly participated in for days, without ever suspecting the true stakes involved. I need time, she said finally, her voice quieter now, though still carrying the hurt of his deception. I need to think about all of this, Draven. You cannot simply tell me we are fated to be together, and expect that to erase the fact that you deceived me for days. I understand, he said quietly, though the fear of losing her entirely gripped him tightly. Take whatever time you need, Ren. I will not press you further tonight, but please know that everything else I told you, everything I felt in these quiet days we shared together, that was always true, regardless of the name I was using. She nodded once, still holding the ring in her trembling palm, before turning and retreating to her own room, leaving Draven standing alone in the doorway, with the weight of his deception finally, fully exposed, and no certainty remaining about whether the bond he had discovered would survive the truth he had waited too long to share. Neither of them slept well that night, each lying awake in separate rooms, wrestling with thoughts too tangled to easily resolve. Ren stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom, turning the signet ring over and over in her fingers, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had helped her carry water from the well, with the powerful king, whose crest was pressed into the heavy metal she held. She thought about the way his eyes had softened whenever he looked at her, a warmth that had felt genuine even now, even knowing the deception that had accompanied it. She thought about her grandmother's words about fate placing the right people in one's path, and wondered bitterly whether fate had truly guided her to the lake that night, or whether circumstance alone had made her an unwitting participant in a king's elaborate escape from his own responsibilities. Down the hall, Draven stared at the wooden beams of his borrowed ceiling, replaying every conversation, every shared silence, every moment of warmth he had experienced within these cottage walls. He had known, somewhere in his heart, that maintaining this deception could not continue indefinitely, yet he had allowed himself to hope, foolishly perhaps, that he might find the right moment to reveal the truth gently, on his own terms, rather than through an accidental discovery that had stripped away his choice entirely. He thought of his father, a man who had never known the warmth of a true mate bond, who had ruled through duty alone, and had seemed, in his final years, hollowed out by the absence of any genuine connection beyond political alliance. Draven had assumed that same fate awaited him, until Ren had pulled him from the water and shown him what genuine care, without expectation of reward, could actually feel like. He could not lose this now, not after finally understanding what he had been missing his entire life. But he also understood that forcing the issue, pressing Ren before she was ready, would only deepen the wound his deception had already caused. Morning arrived with a tension so thick within the cottage walls that even Nora, usually perceptive but rarely intrusive, could not help but notice something significant had shifted between the two young people she had welcomed into her home. "Something has happened," she said simply, watching Ren pick at her breakfast without appetite, while Draven sat at the opposite end of the table, equally subdued and unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. Ren glanced at Draven, who gave a small, resigned nod, silently granting permission for her to share the truth with her grandmother if she chose to do so. "Rune is not his real name," Ren said finally, her voice careful. "He is Draven Ashcroft, the Alpha King." Nora's expression did not shift, with the shock Ren might have expected. Instead, the old woman studied Draven for a long, thoughtful moment, before nodding slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "I wondered," she admitted. "No ordinary traveler carries himself with such quiet authority, even while trying so hard to appear humble." "You are not angry?" Ren asked, surprised by her grandmother's calm acceptance of information that had left her own emotions in such turmoil. Nora reached across the table, patting her granddaughter's hand gently. "Anger accomplishes little, child. What matters now is what the two of you decide to do with the truth that has finally come to light. Deception born of desperation is different from deception born of cruelty. I have watched this young man these past days, and whatever else he has hidden, His care for you has never once seemed false to these old eyes. Draven felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly woman, though he understood her acceptance did not automatically translate into Ren's forgiveness. I owe you both an apology I cannot fully express in words, he said quietly. I never intended to cause this kind of pain, especially not to the person who saved my life, without asking for anything in return. Ren remained quiet for a long moment, processing everything, before finally speaking again. What happens now? She asked. You cannot stay hidden here forever. Your pack needs you, and eventually, someone else will discover the truth, just as I did. Draven nodded, understanding the reality she was pointing toward. I need to return, he admitted. Soon. There is chaos building in my absence, and I owe it to my people to reclaim my throne and set things right before the situation grows beyond repair. But Ren, I do not want to simply disappear from your life the way I disappeared from that ceremony. Whatever happens next, I want you to have a genuine choice in the matter, not an obligation forced upon you by circumstance or fate. What kind of choice? She asked quietly. He hesitated only a moment before continuing, his voice steady despite the vulnerability the words required. I believe you are my true mate, Ren. My wolf has never responded to anyone the way it responds to you, not even during months of forced courtship with someone the council selected for entirely political reasons. But I will not force that bond upon you, regardless of what my instincts tell me is true. If you choose to walk away from all of this, from me, from the complications that come with pack politics and royal obligation, I will respect that choice, however much it might cost me. And if I choose otherwise, Ren asked softly. Then you would be choosing a life far more complicated than anything you have known here in this quiet village, he said honestly. Political intrigue, public scrutiny, the burden of representing an entire pack alongside me. It would not be an easy path, Ren, and I would understand completely if that price feels too high for a bond you did not ask for and did not choose to walk into knowingly. Ren sat with his words for a long moment, glancing briefly at her grandmother, who offered no direct guidance, only a patient, encouraging silence that left the decision entirely in her granddaughter's hands. I need to think, Ren said finally, though something in her tone had softened slightly compared to the previous night's hurt. But Draven, thank you for finally being honest, even if it took an accidental discovery to bring that honesty forward. That matters to me, more than you might realize. He nodded, understanding that this was not yet forgiveness, not yet the answer he desperately hoped for, but perhaps the beginning of a path back toward the trust his deception had damaged, if she chose to walk that path alongside him, rather than away from it entirely. While Ren wrestled with her decision over the following 2 days, events back at the pack house accelerated faster than Gareth's careful delay tactics could contain. Elena Whitfield, growing impatient with the council's continued hesitation, decided to force the issue through a bold and dangerous maneuver of her own. She called an emergency assembly of the pack's senior enforcers, presenting herself not as a grieving betrothed, but as a decisive leader stepping forward during a moment of crisis. My beloved Draven is gone, she announced to the assembled enforcers, her voice carrying practiced sorrow mixed with steely resolve. But the pack cannot afford paralysis while the council debates procedure. I am prepared to assume temporary authority, guided by the closest bond recognized to our king, until proper succession can be determined. Several enforcers, uncertain and eager for clear direction after days of uncertainty, began murmuring in cautious support. Percy Ashford, informed quickly of the gathering, arrived just in time to interrupt Elena's momentum, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent navigating pack politics. This assembly has no legal standing, he declared firmly, stepping into the center of the room despite his advanced age. Succession decisions belong to the full council, not to enforcers gathered hastily by a woman, with no confirmed bond to our king. I demand this gathering disperse immediately, before Lady Whitfield leads this pack into a crisis far greater than the uncertainty we currently face. Elena's expression hardened, the mask of grief slipping to reveal the calculating ambition beneath. You would leave the pack leaderless, out of stubborn adherence to procedure, Percy, while enemies at our borders sense weakness and consider whether our territory might be vulnerable to challenge? There are no enemies gathering at our borders, Percy countered evenly. Only your own ambition, dressed in the language of urgency and crisis. I will not stand by while you manipulate frightened enforcers into supporting a claim that has no legitimate foundation. The confrontation might have escalated further had Gareth not arrived at that precise moment. having received urgent word of the gathering, while making his own careful arrangements to return to Draven's location. He stepped into the tense chamber, his presence commanding immediate attention given his respected standing among the enforcement ranks. "I have information relevant to this situation," Gareth announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "Information that changes everything, currently being discussed in this room." Elena's eyes narrowed with sudden wariness. "What information?" she demanded. Gareth hesitated only a moment, weighing his promise to Draven against the escalating crisis threatening to spiral beyond anyone's control. "The Alpha King is alive," he said finally, his words landing like a physical blow across the assembled crowd. "I have confirmed his location personally. He staged his own disappearance to escape the forced marriage arrangement, and he intends to return soon to reclaim his throne and address this council directly." Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the chamber, shock and relief mixing with confusion among the enforcers who had gathered, expecting to discuss a succession crisis rather than a revelation of this magnitude. Percy's weathered face broke into an expression of profound relief, years of tension visibly easing from his shoulders. Elena, meanwhile, went pale with a mixture of shock and dawning horror, the realization crashing over her that her entire plan, weeks in the careful making, had just collapsed in an instant. "He is alive," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He faked his own death to escape our marriage?" "That is correct," Gareth confirmed, his tone carrying no sympathy for the woman whose ambitions had nearly torn the pack apart in the king's absence. "And I would suggest, Lady Whitfield, that you consider carefully how your actions during this crisis will be perceived once His Majesty returns and learns the full extent of what has transpired in his name during these past days." Elena said nothing further, her expression a mixture of fury and calculation, as she quickly reassessed her position within a rapidly shifting political landscape. The assembled enforcers began dispersing, whispers of the astonishing news spreading quickly throughout the packhouse, certain to reach every corner of the territory before the day's end. Percy approached Gareth quietly once the chamber had mostly emptied, his expression serious, despite the relief still evident in his bearing. "When will he return?" Percy asked. "Soon," Gareth answered honestly. "There are matters he needs to resolve first, personal matters, that I believe will prove significant once he explains them fully. But I do not believe he intends to delay his return much longer, especially now that his survival has become common knowledge throughout the packhouse." Percy nodded slowly, understanding, without needing further explanation, that whatever had kept the king hidden these past days involved more than simple political strategy. "Then we shall prepare for his return properly," he said, "and address whatever consequences follow from Lady Whitfield's actions during this troubling interlude." Wren found Draven sitting near the edge of the small garden behind the cottage on the morning of the third day, staring out toward the distant tree line with an expression of quiet contemplation that softened when he noticed her approaching. "I have made my decision," she said without preamble, settling onto the wooden bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He turned to face her fully, his heart pounding with an anticipation he could not fully mask, despite years of practice controlling his expressions during political negotiations, far less personally significant than this moment. "I am listening," he said quietly. "These past days have been the strangest and most confusing of my entire life," Wren began, choosing her words carefully. "I fell in love with a man named Rune, only to discover he was actually the Alpha King of an entire pack. Someone whose life is filled with politics and obligations I barely understand. I was angry, Draven. I still feel echoes of that hurt, knowing you let me care for someone who did not fully exist in the way I believed." He nodded, accepting her words without protest, understanding that whatever came next needed to be heard fully, rather than interrupted by his own eagerness for reassurance. "But I have also spent these past days thinking about everything else you told me," she continued. "About your wolf recognizing something in me from the very beginning, about feeling more genuine warmth in this small cottage than you have felt in years, surrounded by wealth and power. And I have thought about my own feelings, which never once felt false, regardless of what name you were using." Her hand found his, small fingers intertwining with his larger ones, and something in his chest eased at the simple gesture of connection. "I do not know how to be a queen," Wren admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "I do not understand politics or council procedures or the weight of representing an entire pack, but I know how I feel when I am near you, and I know that feeling has never once been about your title or your crown. I am choosing you, Draven, she said finally, meeting his eyes with a certainty that took his breath away. Not because fate demands it, and not because your wolf recognizes some bond I do not fully understand yet. I am choosing you because these past days, getting to know Rune, showed me a man worth choosing, regardless of whatever title comes attached to him. Draven felt something powerful surge through his chest, relief and joy and a fierce protectiveness, all mixing together as he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, with a reverence that spoke louder than any words he could have offered. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display. "Ren, I promise you, I will spend every day proving that this choice was the right one. I will not ask you to change who you are to fit some mold of royal expectation. Whatever we build together, we will build it as equals, choosing each other freely, exactly as you have chosen me now." She smiled at him then, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had offered since discovering his true identity. And something in the quiet garden shifted, the last remnants of hurt and distrust, giving way to a foundation of honesty, upon which something far stronger could now be built. "But there is still the matter of your pack," she said practically, ever grounded despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Your council, your enforcers, and the woman who was supposed to become your wife before all of this happened. That will not be a simple homecoming, Draven." "No," he agreed, his expression turning serious as he considered the confrontation awaiting him back at the pack house. "It will not be simple, but I will face it, and I would very much like you beside me when I do, if you are willing to take that step with me." Ren squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the same determination that had carried her into cold lake water to save a stranger's life without a moment's hesitation. "I am willing," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we will face it together." Their return to the pack house 3 days later drew every eye in the territory, word having spread quickly of the Alpha King's imminent arrival, following his miraculous survival. Draven walked through the grand entrance with Ren at his side, her hand steady in his despite the overwhelming attention suddenly directed toward her, an unranked Omega who now found herself standing beside the most powerful man in the entire pack. Percy greeted them first, relief evident in every line of his aged face as he bowed formally before Draven, a gesture the king quickly waved away in favor of a warm, genuine embrace between two people who had weathered political storms together for years. "Your Majesty," Percy said, his voice thick with emotion. "We feared the worst, though Gareth's news gave us hope these past days." "I owe you an explanation," Draven said, his expression serious. "And an apology for the chaos my absence created, though I believe the circumstances justified drastic action on my part." The full council convened within hours of his return, the chamber packed tighter than Draven had ever seen it, every member eager to hear the explanation behind his elaborate disappearance, and equally curious about the young Omega standing quietly but confidently at his side. Draven addressed the assembly with the authority of a king who had found renewed purpose during his time away, explaining without hesitation the forced marriage he had refused to accept, the desperate plan he had devised to escape it, and the unexpected rescue that had led him to discover his true fated mate in a woman none of them had ever considered significant within pack politics. "I faked my death because I refused to be a puppet king, controlled by a marriage designed solely to consolidate certain families' political power," he explained, his gaze sweeping across the assembled council members, lingering pointedly on Elena Whitfield's pale, tense face. "I have since discovered something far more valuable than any political alliance could have offered. I have found my true mate, chosen freely, without coercion or political calculation, and I intend to claim that bond publicly, regardless of whatever objections certain parties might raise." Elena rose from her seat, fury and desperation mixing in her expression as she attempted one final gambit to salvage her position. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "surely you understand the political implications of rejecting our arranged bond in favor of an unranked Omega, with no family standing, no political connections, nothing to offer this pack beyond a chance rescue at the lake." Draven's expression hardened, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority as he responded. "Ren Sutter offered me something no political alliance ever could, Lady Whitfield. She offered genuine care without expectation of reward, honesty without political calculation, and a connection my own wolf recognized as true from the very first moment we met. That is worth more to me than any family name or political advantage you could ever provide." He turned then to address the full council, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Furthermore," he continued, "I have been informed of Lady Whitfield's actions during my absence, including her attempt to claim authority over this pack through manipulation of frightened enforcers, rather than legitimate succession procedures. Such actions demonstrate exactly the kind of ambition unchecked by genuine care for this pack's well-being that I refuse to reward with the throne beside me." Elena's face went white with the realization that her scheming had not only failed, but had been exposed publicly, destroying any remaining credibility she might have salvaged. Several council members who had previously wavered in their support now regarded her with open suspicion, understanding fully the extent of her ambitious maneuvering during the crisis. "I believe," Percy said formally, breaking the tense silence that followed Draven's declaration, "that the council should formally recognize Wren Sutter's rescue of our king, and her subsequent claim as his true mate, according to the ancient laws governing fated bonds, that supersede political arrangement in matters of succession." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, the tide of opinion shifting decisively away from Elena's ambitions and toward acceptance of the unexpected path fate had carved for their king. Elena, recognizing the completeness of her defeat, gathered what remained of her dignity and departed the chamber without further protest, understanding that continued resistance would only further damage whatever standing she might hope to salvage within pack society moving forward. With the immediate political crisis resolved, Draven turned his full attention toward Wren, who had remained quietly composed throughout the entire confrontation, despite the overwhelming scrutiny directed her way. He took her hand once more, addressing the assembled council with words that would soon spread throughout the entire territory. "I claim Wren Sutter as my true mate," he declared formally, his voice steady and certain. "Not because ancient law demands it, and not because political convenience suggests it, but because my heart and my wolf both recognize a truth deeper than any crown or council procedure could ever provide. She saved my life without hesitation, expecting nothing in return, and in doing so, she saved me from becoming the hollow, duty-bound king my circumstances were pushing me to become." The chamber erupted into applause, enforcers and council members alike recognizing the genuine emotion behind his words, understanding that whatever chaos his elaborate escape had caused, it had ultimately led their king toward a bond far more valuable than any political alliance could have provided. Wren, overwhelmed by the public declaration and the warmth of acceptance flooding through the chamber, felt tears of genuine joy finally breaking free after days of uncertainty and hidden fear about how this moment might unfold. She squeezed Draven's hand tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead in her new role, she would face them with a partner who had chosen her as fiercely and genuinely as she had chosen him. In the weeks that followed, as their formal mating ceremony was prepared and pack life gradually returned to stability under Draven's renewed leadership, Wren often found herself thinking back to that fateful night at Silver Lake, when instinct alone had driven her into cold water to save a stranger's life, without a single thought for the consequences. She had believed, at the time, that she was simply doing what any decent person would do, offering help to someone in danger, regardless of personal cost. She had not known, could not have known, that her small act of unconditional courage would ultimately reshape not only her own life, but the future of an entire pack, proving that true worth had nothing to do with rank or recognition, and everything to do with the genuine strength of an open, willing heart. Draven, for his part, ruled his pack with a renewed sense of purpose in the years that followed, guided always by the lessons learned during those quiet days in Wren's humble cottage, where he had discovered that true strength lay not in the crown he wore, but in the honest connections he chose to build with those around him. The Alpha King who had once faked his own drowning to escape a hollow future found, in the end, that his true rescue had never been from the lake at all, but from the isolation and emptiness of a life lived entirely for duty, finally broken open by the fearless kindness of a sweet Omega who had asked for nothing and received everything in return.